Hello, freaks, geeks, degenerates, basement dwellers, and internet weirdos. Welcome to the Warzone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And there's obviously a lot happening along the front line down in Ukraine, Kupiansk, Sumy, Zaporizhia, all over the place. But we are gonna focus a bit on Pokrovsk and the things going on, potential things that are going on in and around Pokrovsk in this particular video. So I might do a regular frontline update video tomorrow, but this video it's going to be about Pokrovsk and the potential trap and maybe a potential blitz. It might be a bit too late to call it a blitz, but anyway, it's going to upset the Vatniks, so we're going to call it a blitz. So, are we seeing deliberate action by Ukraine at Pokrovsk? Let's take a look. So, it all comes down to a video recently made today, by the way, by Alliance on Maps, where he explores if the Russian Pokrovsk quote-unquote breakthrough was actually a Ukrainian trap, based on a Telegraph article that seems to hint and indicate that the Ukrainians had spotted the Russian buildup. They were prepared for it and had moved in reinforcements prior to the assault, and they just waited for it to happen and then sprung the trap, as it were. And so I'm going to provide a link, if I remember, to this video. Otherwise, just see if you can find lines on maps on YouTube, and you will find the video. But so he talks about it for, what is it, 12 and a half minutes, and the importance of drones and stuff like that. And he keeps repeating that the evidence for this being a trap, they're kind of sketchy. But, the Ukrainians seems to have responded rather quickly to it, as if they were prepared. But it's funny, for a channel called Lines on Maps, he didn't bring up this map that is full of lines. And people who have been watching my videos, I've been using this for a couple of months. It's readily available online by now. It highlights Ukrainian defensive positions and stuff like that. It's breaking OPSEC 7 Ways to Sunday. But it's been out for a long time, so I'm not doing any additional harm, as it were, right? It's all over X, Twitter, Twix, whatever you want to call it, and was on X, Twix for a long time before I started using it. So we're going to use this map to take a closer look at the situation in and around Pokrovsk and the parts that I have highlighted that has made me wonder what the Ukrainians were up to, if they actually were up to something. And it kinda aligns with this video and what it has to say about the situation. And zooming in, we can now see I've highlighted a couple of things here. This circle here is Pokrovsk, Mirnorad, Rodynske, Shakove, and Dobropilya. Here is the Syrsky line that the Russians infiltrated. And here you can see, and I've been talking about this for quite some time now, these open spaces, the yellow, indicate Ukrainian trench lines, bunkers, foxholes, defensive positions. And the Syrsky line is, of course, the latest addition, being more thoroughly thought through and built up and what have you, with this massive hub up here. But as you can see, there are pockets here and there outside of Pokrovsk. Here, for instance, here and here. And I have been, for a couple of months, been wondering why is Ukraine leaving these pockets? There must be a reason to it. You can see down here, again, a huge pocket. This is where Russia made a credible advance a month or two ago, and then when they reached this point, they just hit a wall and haven't been able to advance any further at all since they moved through the open spaces. And then boom, I believe this is where Ukraine has made those counterattacks when they moved 8 kilometers in a day. It's it's over here, isn't it? So you can see where these gaps are open, Russia can advance relatively fast. And they moved up here and then crossed at Razine right here and moved up into this pocket here. Remember, Rodinske? And then they were in this pocket. And then they started infiltrating north, as we saw on Deep State and what have you. And then they made that big push north through this thin line into this relatively open area. Right? Again, wide open spaces. And I was saying it's weird that Ukraine is leaving these gaps. There must be a purpose to it. There must be reason for it. And Russia is more or less following the path of least resistance, which makes them predictable. Right? You remember this, right, when I've been talking about this. And I was also talking, if people were worried about Dobropilya when they broke through, and I was like, Dobropilya is not the target, because going over here means it's a very thin, narrow approach here where the Russians will be shot at from every angle if they're coming up here and then turning sharply west. They're going to be shot to pieces in here, shot to pieces here, and shot to pieces trying to push west, coming in between the Ukrainian defensive lines. So, I mean, with this video combined with the things I've been talking about, Russia moving along the path of least resistance, entering these obvious kill zones, kill boxes, and if Ukraine spots Russia building up forces, I mean, then they know Russia's only have two ways to go, north or south into these open spaces. So these defensive positions suggests that Ukraine was trying to guide Russia into certain areas. Or maybe that was the purpose of leaving these gaps. I don't know, but I mean, I've been wondering why these gaps have been placed or been left alone like they have been. Maybe it actually was intentional to guide the Russians into certain kill zones. I think this is definitely a kill zone, as is here. And maybe the Ukrainians expected Russia to make a push up here and then had the troops ready when they saw a buildup of forces to counter this push as it eventually was launched, essentially, right? I mean, why else would Ukraine leave these massive gaps in otherwise very dense defensive lines? And here's the advance up to the Syrsky line. The Syrsky line is here, this line here. And it's interesting to note that Ukraine began operations engaging Russian infiltration units, infiltration groups on the 4th of August. Now, the big push began on the 10th or the 11th. Map updates began on the 11th, so maybe the push itself began on the 10th. But on the 4th, Ukraine has come out and said that they were beginning cleanup operations in these towns, deep into Ukrainian territory. So if they were engaging Russians on the 4th, this far behind enemy lines, maybe they were like, something might be going on. And we know we have Russians down here. We know they've been trying to sneak their way through. Maybe we should move reinforcements to the area and be prepared for something might actually happen. And when the big push came north, trying to link up with forward elements that the Ukrainians had already been engaging for a couple of days, they might have been prepared and might have closed the gap behind the forward elements coming through here. You can see here there are only a couple of few windbreaks that Ukraine had to push in and secure to cut off the Russians in the north. So maybe they were prepared for it. Russia had moved in light infantry and motorcycles, light skin vehicles, and the Ukrainians pushed in with combat vehicles and what have you, and could then overtake the Russians in these few windbreaks, and in so doing cutting off the forward elements, and they were then forced to fall back from these villages to the area here at Kucherev Yar. It's not unthinkable. it's not unthinkable. And there was also a big push by Ukraine into Nikolaevka, and Russia has countered this with an artillery screen from Novoshakovo. Ukraine pushed into Novoshakovo as well. So an artillery screen from Novoshakovo down to Nikolaevka to secure the breach point itself and the high ground here that the Russians have taken. So yeah, I mean, it's not unthinkable that the drones spotted all the buildup. Ukraine was engaging targets deep behind their own line, within their own lines, realizing something might be going on, quietly moved troops into position, and they knew the Russians were following the path of least resistance and that something was going to happen. So maybe the Ukrainians, after all, were prepared for something. But that said, we must not forget that this was a much larger operation than simply the push north. Russia did make an attempt to push straight west, and if you remember the image where the defenses were at Rodinsk, it was a thick yellow area here north of Pokrovsk. This area here is heavily defended with trench lines and bunkers and what have you, according to that map, not an open gap. And Russia tried to push through here despite this. So it was two pushes involved in this larger operation, and we can see this push west on a couple of maps here. You have ISW showing us the push west, Andrew Perpetua as well over here, Mayakovsk 73 also. So two pushes, west and north, was part of this breakthrough operation, where the Russians wanted to cut supply lines close to the action, right here at Chakova, here at Rodinsk, to cut supplies coming into Pokrovsk, with frontline units and securing territory here, to deny Ukraine any chance of using these supply lines. And also this push into this area would give Russia an excellent position to threaten Chakova from the west, since there's a river protecting Chakova to the east. And they also made an all-out assault on Rodinsk, trying to come in from the north, securing a factory here, securing windbreaks here, and trying to come in from the south as well through windbreaks to reaching the supply line. And there was a frontal assault supported by massed artillery and massed airstrikes, and combined with these infiltration groups trying to reach the rearmost supply line, just like up here. So cutting the supply lines closer to the action, disrupting supply lines furthest away from the action. That was the big intent of this breakthrough operation. Ukraine launched a counterattack here right at the base of the breakthrough. Some mappers actually indicate that Russia might still have a connection with their forces right here at the north of Rodinsk. So I've updated my other map. This is an old map. So I updated it with that connection here. But Ukraine made a strong push into this railway here that Russia had secured for a day or two. And then, of course, Ukraine made a assault here to cut off the Russians up in the north. So the Ukrainians were ready. They made a big push here, big push here. It sort of aligns with the thinking that they were prepared for it. You had a much more successful Russian advance, where the Ukrainians did not have as many defensive positions. And as you can see, the push through here, where the Ukraine had a lot of defensive positions, the breakthrough was not as impressive, and the Russians were more focused on trying to secure Rodinsk with this frontal assault and flanking maneuvers than going deep. Going north, they wanted to go deep if they could, but essentially, to my mind, the primary objective was to outflank Chakova, and anything north reaching the Syrskyi line would be a bonus, since there was hardly any artillery and airstrikes supporting the push up here in the north. So improving the situation at Chakova, securing Rodinsk, cutting the supply lines close to the action, disrupting supply lines furthest away. And I just want to highlight this as well. Just south of this image, you have Kotlina and Udachne, where Russia has cut 2 or 3 supply lines leading into Pokrovsk. They're just south of the image here, the Russian lines, just south down here. Had the Ukrainians managed to push through here and disrupting, maybe cutting, if they have successfully pushed through here and kept this open and pushed troops through here and reaching Novo Alexandrivka and successfully cutting these 2 supply lines, Pokrovsk would have only had a single supply line open, that one right here, the E50. And if Russians had pulled this off, Mirnorad and Pokrovsk would essentially have been surrounded, cut off, and it would not have been sustainable trying to hold the cities if there was just this one supply line. I've said in the past that all they need is one supply line, but if Russia was up here and just south of it, I mean, it would have been it would only have been a matter of time for Russians to move in and close this gap, if you ask me, and that would have put a lot of pressure on Pokrovsk. So that Ukraine is holding the line here is far more important than the Ukrainians doing any operations up here, even if this is the main focus of all reporting. And was it a trap? Maybe. I think it might have been a trap. This is where you had that first gap. This is where you had that thin defensive line. Russia punched through, moved up into this area with hardly any defenses at all, and Ukraine was really fast to pick up the situation and move in and cut off Russians here, and moving down strongly here to cut off the Russians going west. Remember, on the 4th, the Ukrainians began reporting that they were engaging Russian units up here this far behind, this deep into Ukrainian lines. So, trap or not, I leave that up to you. Now we're gonna move on to the other potential Ukrainian brilliant move in the area. And we are, of course, talking about the move down here towards Myrne. Was this a planned assault, or were they just exploiting a weakness in the Russian advance and they realized, holy shit, we're through, and now they are trying to exploit the situation? Who knows? We're going to zoom in here a bit, because this is more important than I think people realize. If Ukraine can exploit, I know I've been making a lot of community posts about Ukrainian hopium and pointing out just how important this is if Ukraine can bring in troops to this area. First of all, different mappers are showing different things. ISW claims that the push came between these 2 lakes going straight north. Other mappers are saying it's coming through Novoekonomice, essentially, almost along this highway towards Myrne. And the confusion stems from Mykolaiivka and Mykhalaivka. Where did Ukraine break through? So this is the confusion, that they break through at Mykhalaivka or at Mykolaiivka. And people appears to have issues figuring out what has happened. I based my map on the ISW report, and then other mappers have since then shown this other approach. So who knows which is true? Anyway, the important thing is that Ukraine is in Myrne and maybe are beginning to push into Malinivka as well, but we know they are in Myrne. They've taken Myrne. And the importance is real. This can have massive implications for the Russians and the Ukrainians as well, which is why I believe Russia will not hold back 1 inch trying to secure Myrne and reclaim it. Because here's the thing, say that Ukraine pushes in troops here. They realize that they had a gap, they realize they reached Myrne, and they are now relocating units like crazy to this area, racing from the Rodinsk or wherever through town to come up this way and reach Myrne. Say that they managed to do that. Take a look what that might what the implications might be. Kopcheve is 3 or 4 kilometers to the north of Myrne. Shevchenko-Perche as well. It's 3 or 4 kilometers. Not a massive distance to travel. And as you can see, Ukraine has 2 options in doing it, basically. Moving along this windbreak and coming into this small valley and moving north along this windbreak. Since troops are moving along windbreaks in this war. If they have the manpower and resources to pushing north along both of these windbreaks and reach Kopcheve, that means they have a solid defensive box from Myrne to Kopcheve that the Russians would actually struggle to break through. It's just not one defensive line, it's, well, 2 with smaller towns, villages anchoring each end. You have a valley and what have you. This would be a very credible defensive position for the Ukrainians, this area here, if they manage to do it. And if they can hold the line here. It's a very thin line, as you can see here. So the Russians have some options in trying to break the line here, absolutely. But we're playing with the idea that Ukraine solidifies and holds terrain here. What this means, if Ukraine can pull this off, and why Russia will focus so heavily on securing Myrne, is if Ukraine does this and secures this area up to Kopcheve here, all the troops over here are cut off. They are essentially cut off and almost isolated. Because if you reach Kopcheve and this valley, you have cut the 2 roads that Russia can rely on. The main road here leading into Novoekonomice, and the road coming up through the valley and Kopcheve to Novotoretske. And what do you have at Novotoretske? A bridge coming across here, right, to Boykivka, right? There are some smaller dirt roads in between, but the main roads flow through Malinivka, goes over to Novoekonomice, and goes north to Shevchenko-Perche, and then continues to Novotoretske. So now you have cut the roads, and as you can see, north of Kopcheve, you have wide open spaces, farmland, wide open spaces. And Russia has basically no options in moving around north of Kopcheve. Yes, you can make it across these wide open fields on these dirt roads, tractor roads, basically. Prime targets for drones. Drones will be hunting these areas like you wouldn't believe if Ukraine reaches Kopcheve. And if the Russians try to move on foot, well, here is a gap where they need to run across to reach cover over here. Again, prime hunting grounds for drones. So now you begin to understand the seriousness of Ukraine reaching Myrne. If Ukraine can push in troops here before the Russians lock them down and they begin advancing north towards Kopcheve, Ukraine will isolate and basically cut off all the Russians over here north of Pokrovsk. Which of course is why I think Russia will allocate a lot of resources to securing the situation and trying to push in and reclaim Myrne. Maybe try and come in between here and severing the contact south. We know Ukraine has pushed up this way. Russia has been throwing in drones at this windbreak. So this is the approach point for the Ukrainians to reaching Myrne and Malinivka. So yeah, and I mean, it happened right after the push up here. Is that a coincidence? So we have this potential trap, and Ukraine pushing in to sever both advances in short order, and just a few days later they make this push out of nowhere that has the potential of actually threatening the entire operation north of Pokrovsk. I mean, it could be coincidences, obviously, but it's interesting. I find it interesting, and this, it is hopium, absolutely, it is hopium. But I mean, a 3 to 4 kilometer push is not unthinkable in this war. That is well within reach of both armies. They do it every now and then, all the time, make these shorter pushes of 2-3 kilometers, maybe 4 kilometers. And I mean, up until a couple of days ago, no one thought Myrne was a threat, right? No one thought Myrne would all of a sudden be under Ukrainian control again. So yeah, Myrne, Ukraine holds it, and it is a severe issue for the Russians. And can Ukraine move up into this box here and threaten Kopcheve? This entire operation here is at risk, and then Ukraine would be isolating thousands of Russians. There would be thousands of Russians trapped here. And it would be a massive disaster for the Russians if that happened. And it all comes down to Ukraine holding on to Myrne, maintaining open logistics all the way to Myrne, and then slowly pushing up along these windbreaks here and securing this box. This box can basically condemn all the Russians up here if Ukraine pushes in here. Quite incredible. And I think it's kind of funny. I mean, I've been calling the battle for Pokrovsk, Stalingrad, the next Stalingrad for quite some time. Began with Stalingrad in 2024, and then eventually when we realized, not gonna happen, it's gonna be Stalingrad 2025. I updated that. But as you can see, 11 months ago, on the 27th of August, is what? That's Jesus. Okay. So that's basically a year ago on the date. How about that? It's the 26th now as I'm recording. So a year ago I made this video. Jesus, and I call it Stalingrad 2024. We can see here Russia had not really reached Pokrovsk yet. But I was talking about what this eventual battle, what it would all come down to and what have you. So Russia was pushing out of Ocherotina and coming down here. So I said they were going to try and push up this way, and if they kept this narrow snaking advance, that would open up for Ukrainian countermoves trying to cut through and sever the push. And I also started mentioning that because of that threat, Russia would probably move down south and widen the front to deny the Ukrainians a chance to come in and cut off the Russian advance. And also that they would try and move around and cut all supply lines into Pokrovsk, because the Russians remember how they eventually defeated the Germans at Stalingrad. Today it's called Volgograd. But what happened at Stalingrad was that the Germans pushed into the city and occupied the entire city essentially, and Russia had only a tiny sliver of a supply line left open that they used to hold the last areas within the city, and the Germans kept pushing in and basically almost surrounded the city and what have you. And eventually what doomed the Germans was that the Russians built up a force in the north that could then drive through the German lines outside of town and cut off and isolate the Germans inside the city. That is what doomed the Germans at Stalingrad. That one narrow supply line that the Russians managed to keep open, and the fact that they made a counter push that cut through German positions and isolated the Germans in the city. And isn't that interesting? Me talking about Pokrovsk being Stalingrad and what have you, and now this situation appears to be happening where the Russians might have overextended, overreached, maybe potentially walked into a Ukrainian trap. And after the Russians had managed that move, pushing through German lines and isolating Russian troops at Stalingrad, that is, of course, when the German army began to slowly break down and the Russians began their counterattacks. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, here, I've been saying all along that the Russians were expanding the lines, I'm moving my arms to emphasize my point, and you can obviously see that, can't you? But trying to push around on the flanks here, making sure that they could not be caught unawares and be caught off, and coming around, trying to reach, like I showed you before, the supply lines coming into town. And yes, at Stalingrad, Russia had this narrow supply line leading into town, and that was enough to hold. So yes, Ukraine needs just this one supply line open to hold at Pokrovsk, definitely. But now we have a situation where the Russians might have overextended. They got cut off here, trapped in the north, potentially cut off here, even though we must acknowledge that this area here might be under Russian control and that they have established a connection with the troops behind Rodinsky, which is a bit worrying. But then again, you have this potential blitzkrieg move by the Ukrainians. It's been a couple of days. It might not be that much of a blitz maneuver. At this point, they really need to exploit the gap and push north in short order for it to be a proper breakthrough here in order to isolate the Russians. But maybe they're moving in forces to build up troops and make that push north. So who knows? If they do, and this is a massive catastrophe for the Russians, how will that affect morale in the Russian army? How will that affect how people in Moscow view this? How generals, soldiers, politicians, and what have you, oligarchs, how will they view such a disaster? But since there is this possibility of this becoming a major Russian disaster, that's why I'm thinking Russia is going to throw everything they have at Myrne to deny the Ukrainians a chance to continue with any maneuvers here, especially maneuvers north to reach Kopchev. That would be my estimate of the situation. Actually, remember this, and the plan was to end the video here after that last bit, but we're going to add this real quick because Ukraine has tried something similar before. It failed, but almost worked. And here you have Rodinsky. This is where Russia tried to push out to Novoalexandrivka. And here you can see if they reach this far, they're down here at the Dashny Kotlina. That E50 runs through here. It would have been a precarious situation for the Ukrainians. Anyway, some months ago, when the front line was something more like this, we all remember what Russia was actually over here. Let's redraw that. It was something like this. Ukraine attempted to push through here, and they attempted to come down through Shevchenko, and they tried to push through Peshani, if we remember. And the reason they did this three-pronged assault was because there's the Solona River runs. What the hell? is going on? The Solona River runs through here, and there's only a couple of bridges, and you had a dam here, as you can see, with a river as well, and there's a river and dam and what have you here. Here you have a crossing at the dam. Had the Ukrainians managed to move through Peshan, Shevchenko, or through Solona to reach this position, that meant they would have cut off the Russians up here at Kotlina, Dutchna, and elsewhere. So Ukraine tried this at much smaller scale, granted, to move through Russian lines to reaching a vital location that was important for Russian maneuvers, to cut off and isolate Russians, in this case north of the Solona River. Kind of like what we're potentially seeing here, where they are trying to isolate the Russians coming up this way and isolating the Russians with these pockets. So the Ukrainians, they've tried it before, and I think they realize that if they do succeed in trapping thousands of Russians in one of these pockets, it would be well and truly a disaster for the Russian army. That's it. I hope you found it interesting. I hope I'll see you in the next one. As always, go på marsch, Ukraine, and give them hell.